"You are fired." 2 words from the mouth of Eleanor Reed, chief executive of one of the largest technology corporations in America. And the boardroom went completely silent. The overhead lights hummed against the glass walls. Somewhere down the hallway, a printer clicked through its final page. Jack Carter did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply nodded, unclipped the badge from his shirt pocket, set it gently on the polished table, and walked out without another sound. Nobody called after him. Nobody stood up. Chairs stayed pushed in around the table long after the door swung shut, and the silence that followed felt less like relief and more like something nobody wanted to name. The door closed behind him with a soft click that nobody in that room would forget 4 days later, when a stack of patent files would turn their entire understanding of the company inside out. Because when the lead attorney opened the folder containing the intellectual property behind a deal worth $3.8 billion, the first name on the first page was Jack Carter. So was the second. So was the third. Pages turned faster now, each one landing with the same quiet weight, each one carrying the same 4 syllables typed into the inventor field. By the time Eleanor reached the 27th patent, her hands had gone still over the table, and the pen she had been holding rolled slowly toward the edge and stopped. The man she fired without a hearing was the mind behind almost everything the company had built, and somewhere across the city, that same man was sitting in a small rented office, entirely unaware that the woman who dismissed him in less than a minute was about to spend the rest of the year trying to undo it. Eleanor Reed was 36 years old, the youngest chief executive in the history of the corporation, a woman who had clawed her way through every layer of the business world with a discipline that bordered on obsession. She ran on 5 hours of sleep and back-to-back meetings, and she measured people the way she measured quarterly numbers, quickly, decisively, and rarely with a second look. She believed in one principle above all others, that talent which mattered would always find a way to be seen, that the truly capable never needed to be discovered because they made themselves impossible to ignore. It was a philosophy she had built her own career on, climbing past men twice her age by making sure every success carried her name loudly attached to it, and she assumed, without ever quite saying so, that anyone who failed to do the same simply did not have anything worth announcing. It was a belief that had served her well in every negotiation and every boardroom fight of her career. And it was a belief that had never once been tested against a man like Jack Carter. Jack was 38, a research engineer with rumpled shirts and a quiet manner, the kind of employee whose name appeared on almost no internal memos because he simply did not write them. He carried the same canvas bag to work every day, drank his coffee black from a chipped mug nobody else would touch, and answered questions in as few words as the question allowed. He never debated in meetings. He never attended the award ceremonies the company held twice a year, claiming a scheduling conflict so consistently that people stopped asking whether it was real. He never spoke at industry conferences, never accepted recognition, never once fought for credit on anything he built, even when a project manager 2 levels below him took the stage to present work that had come entirely out of Jack's own notebooks. To most people in the building, that silence read as laziness, as a man coasting through his years without ambition, content to draw a paycheck and disappear into the background of everyone else's career. Eleanor, who had barely spoken to him more than a handful of times in the 2 years since she became chief executive, had absorbed that same impression without ever questioning it, filing him away in her mind as a name on an org chart rather than a person she had any real reason to understand. What nobody noticed, because nobody was paying attention, was that Jack arrived at the research lab every morning before 5 o'clock, long before the building lights came on for anyone else, letting himself in with a badge that still worked from his earliest years at the company. He stayed with a kind of focus that had nothing to do with performance for an audience, sketching equations on whiteboards that got erased before the first shift arrived, running simulations that nobody else would see the results of for months. Nobody knew what he worked on in those early hours. Nobody asked. The night security guard, an older man named Walter Higgins, was the only person who ever exchanged more than a passing word with him, and even those conversations rarely went beyond a nod and a comment about the weather. Jack kept his notebooks close, his conversations short, and his ambitions, if he had any left, entirely to himself. It was into that silence, into that gap between what a man does and what a company chooses to notice, that the crisis arrived, sudden and expensive, tearing through the calm of an ordinary quarter, and setting in motion the chain of decisions that would nearly cost Eleanor everything she had built her identity around. A flaw surfaced in one of the company's flagship product lines, a defect buried deep in the manufacturing process that resulted in losses climbing into the tens of millions of dollars within a matter of weeks. Retailers began issuing returns faster than the warehouses could process them. News outlets picked up the story before the company had even finished its own internal assessment. And by the time the board convened its emergency session, the damage had already spread across 2 fiscal quarters. The executive board reacted the way boards under pressure often do, with fury aimed outward and a hunger for someone to blame, someone whose name could be attached to the failure, so that the rest of the leadership could walk away from the meeting with their own reputations intact. Every internal report pointed toward the same conclusion: that Jack Carter had been the lead on the research team responsible for the failure, that his division had signed off on the specifications that later proved unstable under sustained use. What those reports did not show, because nobody had bothered to look deeper, was that Jack had sent multiple warnings in the weeks before the failure, flagging the exact weakness that later caused the collapse in a series of detailed messages sent to his direct manager. Those warnings sat unread in an inbox belonging to a manager who had since moved to another department, buried under hundreds of other messages nobody had time for, the kind of oversight that happens quietly in large organizations until it happens loudly and expensively all at once. Jack had even attached a proposed fix to the third message, a modification that would have taken less than 2 weeks to implement. Nobody opened the attachment. Nobody forwarded the thread. It simply sat there, waiting, while the defect worked its way through the manufacturing line undisturbed, ticking silently forward through each new batch that rolled off the assembly floor, until the failures began surfacing in the hands of customers who had no idea a fix had ever existed in the first place. When the crisis finally broke into the open, nobody thought to search the archived messages sitting quietly in an old inbox. It was easier and faster to look at an org chart and find the name attached to the department where the failure occurred. Eleanor did not investigate. She did not request an internal hearing. She did not ask Jack a single question about what had happened before making her decision. Relying instead on a summary report handed to her 20 minutes before the meeting, a report that listed his name at the top of the responsible parties without a single line explaining the warnings he had sent. In front of the assembled leadership team, seated around the same table where the acquisition would later be finalized, she delivered her judgment with the same crisp certainty she brought to every decision that had built her reputation as a woman who never hesitated. "A person who refuses to take responsibility does not belong in this company," she said, and the room nodded along with her, because nobody wanted to be the one who questioned the newly appointed chief executive on her first major crisis. Jack listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his expression unreadable to anyone who did not know him well enough to notice the tightening around his jaw. When she finished, he asked only one question, his voice quiet but steady. Would it be possible to hand over the research files properly before he left, so that whoever inherited his projects would not be working blind? It was not a plea. It was not an attempt to save his position. It was simply a practical concern from a man who cared more about the work outlasting him than about defending his own name. Eleanor told him it would not be necessary, that the transition team would handle it. Jack rose from his chair, walked to the table, and set his badge down without another word, the small plastic rectangle making almost no sound against the polished wood. 3 days later, the company's boardroom filled again, this time for a very different purpose. A private equity fund had arrived to finalize the purchase of an entire technology portfolio. An acquisition valued at $3.8 billion, the largest transaction in the company's history, and the deal that was supposed to define Eleanor's first year as chief executive. Reporters were already drafting headlines. Investor Relations had prepared a press release timed to go out the moment the final signature landed on the page. Lawyers on both sides sat around the table with stacks of paper, signatures ready, champagne already chilling somewhere down the hall in anticipation of a celebration nobody would end up having. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, dressed for the cameras that would be waiting outside within the hour. Running through the talking points she had rehearsed the night before about vision and momentum, and the future of the company under her leadership. She had barely slept, having spent the previous evening reviewing the closing figures with her finance team, and there was a satisfaction sitting quietly behind her composed expression, the particular pride of a leader about to close the largest deal of her career, less than a week after making what she still believed had been a clean, necessary decision about an underperforming employee. The lead attorney representing the acquiring fund, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Whitfield, opened the folder containing the intellectual property behind the portfolio, the patents that gave the technology its value, and began reading through the list of inventors attached to each filing before the final signatures were exchanged. It was a routine step, the kind of due diligence that normally passed without comment, the sort of formality everyone in the room expected to take 10 minutes at most before moving on to the parts of the meeting that actually mattered to them. Pens were already uncapped. Someone near the far end of the table had started a quiet conversation about dinner reservations for that evening. Patricia paused midway through the folder and looked up, her expression shifting from routine boredom into something more focused. "Is Jack Carter still employed with the company?" she asked, glancing between the papers and the row of executives seated across from her. Eleanor answered without hesitation that he was not, that his employment had ended days earlier, her voice carrying the same confidence it always did, the confidence of a woman who did not expect the question to matter. The room went quiet in a way it had not been quiet before, a stillness that had weight to it, the kind of silence that makes people glance sideways at one another without quite knowing why. Patricia set the folder down slowly and said the words that would unravel the rest of the afternoon. "We may have a serious problem," she said, "because the very first patent in this portfolio listed a single inventor, and that inventor's name was Jack Carter." Patricia kept turning pages, and the name kept appearing, again and again, patent after patent, bearing the same single signature. Patent number 12, Jack Carter. Patent number 31, Jack Carter. Patent number 46, Jack Carter. Patent number 59, Jack Carter. Patent number 71, Jack Carter. She read each number aloud in a flat, deliberate voice, as though the repetition itself was the point, as though she wanted every person at that table to feel the weight of it landing again and again. By the time she reached the 9th filing, nobody was thinking about dinner reservations anymore. The executives around the table sat frozen, watching a man they had dismissed without a hearing turn out to be the sole inventor behind the technology that formed the backbone of the deal they were about to sign. Nobody in that room, save perhaps for one or two of the longest-tenured executives, had ever paid enough attention to notice the pattern hiding in plain sight across years of filings, scattered across different departments and different years, never assembled together in one place until this exact moment. Eleanor reached for the folder herself, flipping through pages she had never once thought to read before approving the sale. Her chief financial officer sat beside her, jaw tight, saying nothing. Somewhere down the table, a junior associate quietly closed his laptop, sensing that whatever happened next was not going to be recorded in the minutes the usual way. It was the general counsel, a soft-spoken man named Richard Alvarez, who had been with the company for over 20 years, who finally broke the silence, admitting something that had apparently been known only to a small handful of people at the highest levels of the company for years. The company's original founder, a man named Harold Mitchell, had made a private agreement with Jack long before Eleanor's time, an arrangement that allowed the company free and unlimited use of every invention Jack produced. In exchange for one condition, his name would never be pushed into the public spotlight, never used in marketing, never attached to press releases or investor presentations. It had been a personal understanding between two men who trusted each other, a handshake commitment rather than a piece of corporate strategy, sealed over a conversation in an office that no longer existed in the same form, and it had quietly shaped the company's entire technological foundation without anyone in leadership fully grasping what it meant. Harold had believed, in his own way, that he was protecting Jack from a spotlight the younger engineer never wanted, giving him the freedom to work without the noise of public attention. He had never anticipated that the arrangement would outlive him, or that it would one day collide with a chief executive who had no idea it existed. The founder who made that promise had passed away 3 years earlier, quietly, after a long illness that had kept him away from the company in his final years. The only person left who understood the full scope of what Jack had built, and what he still carried unfinished in his head, was Jack himself. And the company had just let him walk out the door over a product failure he had tried to warn them about in writing. The story of how Jack had become so essential to the company stretched back further than anyone in that boardroom remembered, back to a period when the business had nearly collapsed under the weight of a failed product line and mounting debt, back when the company occupied 2 floors of a modest building, instead of an entire glass tower downtown. In those years, it was Jack. Fresh out of graduate school, and working largely alone in a cramped lab with second-hand equipment, who had produced a breakthrough algorithm that saved an entire division from being shut down just months after he was hired. Harold Mitchell himself had walked into that lab one evening, expecting nothing, and left 2 hours later with a solution that would keep hundreds of employees from losing their jobs. Later, it was a new material Jack developed, born out of hundreds of failed prototypes and long nights nobody else witnessed, that cut manufacturing costs enough to keep the company competitive against larger rivals who had far greater resources and far larger research budgets. Later still, a control system that solved a stability problem engineers twice his seniority had failed to crack for the better part of 2 years, a problem that had nearly caused the company to abandon an entire product category before Jack quietly submitted a fix that worked on the first attempt. And after that, the foundation of an artificial intelligence platform that would eventually become the centerpiece of the very portfolio, now sitting on the table in front of the acquiring fund's lawyers, a platform Jack had spent nearly 4 years building in fragments, testing in isolation, refining alone, long after everyone else in the building had gone home. Harold Mitchell had been the kind of founder who still walked the factory floor himself, long after the company had grown too large for that habit to make practical sense, and it was on one of those walks that he first noticed a young engineer staying late without being asked to, running numbers on a whiteboard nobody had assigned him. Harold did not offer Jack a promotion that night. He offered him something rarer, a promise that he would never be pressured to perform for recognition he did not want, that his work could simply exist and matter without needing to be announced to justify itself. Jack, who had spent his early career watching louder colleagues take credit for ideas that were not entirely their own, took the offer without hesitation. It was the only kind of contract he had ever wanted. Each time the company faced a crisis that threatened its survival, Jack had quietly solved it, and each time, he allowed the company to take credit for the solution without ever asking for a share of ownership, a promotion, or a single mention in the press. He had watched other engineers accept awards for adaptations of his own work without correcting the record, had sat in the back of rooms while executives described breakthroughs as though they had arrived at them personally, and had said nothing each time, because saying something had never been part of the agreement he made with Harold. Eleanor, who had not yet risen to leadership during those years, having joined the company only 6 years earlier from a rival firm, had never learned any of this history. Nobody had ever thought to tell her, because in the culture the company had built, the people who solved problems quietly were never the ones whose stories got passed down through the hallways and the retirement dinners and the years of institutional memory that shaped how new leaders understood the company they now ran. News that Jack Carter had left the company spread quickly through an industry that watched talent the way hawks watch open fields, and it did not take long before competitors understood exactly what his departure meant. The information moved the way it always does in that world, through a former colleague mentioning it over drinks, through a recruiter who heard a rumor and made a phone call just to check, through the kind of quiet networks that never show up in any official announcement but move faster than press releases ever could. 3 rival technology corporations reached out to him within the same week, each one offering a different version of the same promise. Unlimited resources, a private lab, a team assembled entirely around his direction. 2 private investment funds followed soon after, drawn less by any single product and more by the sheer volume of patents attached to his name patents that suggested a mind capable of producing value on a scale most companies waited a decade to see from an entire department. Even a major defense contractor, aware of the platform Jack had built and the applications it might have beyond commercial use, sent representatives to meet with him directly, arriving in dark suits, with proposals thick enough to require their own binder. The offers on the table exceeded $500 million combined, along with ownership stakes in dedicated research facilities, equity positions, and full creative control over whatever he chose to build next. Jack listened to each of them politely, asked few questions, and gave no answers, which only made the offers grow larger as the week went on. One representative from a rival firm, a well-dressed executive named Marcus Webb, sat across from him in a coffee shop near the research space and slid a folded letter across the table, without a word, a number written inside that would have set Jack up for the rest of his life without ever working another day. Jack read it, folded it back closed, and slid it gently across the table toward Webb again. "It is not about the number," he said, and left it at that, offering no further explanation, though the words would be repeated in industry circles for months afterward, as executives tried to understand what exactly a man like that actually wanted, if not money and not power. Nobody quite believed the simplest answer, that he only wanted to keep building things that worked, and to have his name attached honestly to what he built. Meanwhile, word of the acquisition complications had leaked just enough to spook the markets, a single unattributed comment from someone close to the deal, finding its way into a financial newsletter, before spreading across trading floors within hours. The company's stock began sliding, as investors sensed that something fundamental had gone wrong behind the scenes, dropping several points before the opening bell had even finished ringing on the second day. Analysts who had praised Eleanor's leadership only weeks earlier began quietly revising their language, describing the situation as a governance concern rather than a mere personnel matter. Shareholders who had been silent through the earlier crisis suddenly found their voices, demanding answers about what exactly had happened to the intellectual property underpinning the largest deal in company history, flooding the investor relations line with calls that nobody on staff felt equipped to answer honestly. Faced with a collapsing valuation and a board that had turned openly hostile toward her leadership, Eleanor made a decision that surprised almost everyone who knew her. Rather than sending a lawyer or a human resources representative to negotiate on the company's behalf, the way protocol and every advisor around her insisted she should, she decided to go find Jack herself. Alone, without a driver, without an assistant trailing behind her with a tablet full of talking points. She found him not at a rival corporation, not behind the glass walls of some gleaming new office built by a competitor, eager to show off its newest acquisition, but in a small research space on the edge of the city, cluttered with blueprints and half-finished prototypes, the kind of workspace that had no waiting room and no assistant guarding the door. The building smelled faintly of solder and old coffee. A single window let in gray afternoon light across a workbench covered in components she did not recognize. There were no bodyguards, no polished lobby, no evidence of the wealth and power that had just been offered to him by 3 different corporations, only a man in a flannel shirt bent over a circuit board with a soldering iron in one hand. Jack looked up from his workbench when she entered, unsurprised, as though he had expected this visit might come eventually, though he said nothing to invite her further inside. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment before she spoke, and when she finally did, her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I was wrong," she told him. It was the first time in her career that a woman known for her pride and her certainty had walked into a room and admitted, without qualification, that she had failed. No lawyer standing beside her to soften it, no prepared statement, no attempt to frame it as anything other than exactly what it was. Jack set the soldering iron down and looked at her for a moment before answering, choosing his words the way he chose everything, carefully and without excess. "You did not ask me a single question," he said. Eleanor nodded. Because there was nothing to say against that. No defense that would not sound hollow in the space between them. Jack did not gloat, and he did not soften the moment with forgiveness he did not yet feel. He simply told her the truth as he understood it. "I never needed a title," he said. "I only ever wanted someone to actually look at the work." The words landed harder than any accusation could have, because they were not bitter, only honest. The kind of honesty that comes from a man who has spent years being overlooked and has stopped expecting anything different. Eleanor asked him what it would take to bring him back. Jack was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she almost repeated the question. And then, instead of answering directly, he reached for a folder on the corner of his desk and set it in front of her without ceremony. Inside were designs for a project larger and more ambitious than anything he had built during his years at the company. Pages of notation and diagrams that would have meant nothing to most people in that boardroom, but that Eleanor, staring down at them, understood immediately represented something enormous, an idea he had never shared with anyone because there had never been anyone worth sharing it with. She asked him how long he had been working on it. Since before the layoff started, he told her, longer than she expected, longer than the crisis that had cost him his job. She asked why he never mentioned it to anyone in leadership. "Nobody ever asked what I was working on," he said simply. And the words carried no bitterness, only fact. The same way he delivered everything. He had learned a long time ago that a question unasked was a door left closed, and he had never been the kind of man who forced his way through doors that were not opened for him. Eleanor pushed everything she had across that table in the days that followed, returning to the small research space twice more, each time with a new proposal drafted overnight by lawyers who had barely slept. She offered him a substantial raise, well beyond anything the company had ever paid an individual engineer. She offered a significant equity stake, the title of Chief Technology Officer, and decision-making authority over an entire division of the company, a package that would have made him one of the most powerful people in the building. Jack turned all of it down, not out of pride, and not out of spite for what had happened, but because none of it addressed the thing that had actually driven him out the door in the first place. If the culture does not change, he told her during that second visit, sitting across from her at the same cluttered workbench, the next person as capable as I am will leave too. And the one after that, and eventually, there will be no one left willing to do the quiet work that keeps a company like this alive. He said it without anger. The way a man states a fact he has already made peace with. Titles do not fix that, he added. Neither does money. You can pay someone enough to stay for a year. You cannot pay them enough to feel seen. For the first time since she had taken the corner office, Eleanor understood that the problem was never really about Jack Carter as an individual, was never about one badge left on a table or one email that went unread. The problem was a system that had been built, deliberately or not, to reward visibility over substance, to celebrate the people who spoke the loudest in meetings while ignoring the ones who solved the hardest problems in silence, a system she herself had thrived under and had never once thought to question because it had always worked in her favor. She had inherited that system without questioning it, had reinforced it every time she promoted the confident over the competent, and it had cost the company nearly everything it had built over 2 decades in the span of a single week. When she brought her proposed changes back to the board, the response was immediate and hostile. Several board members wanted to pursue legal action against Jack instead, arguing that the company should assert ownership over every patent bearing his name, regardless of the private agreement he had made with the founder, insisting that a handshake promise from a man 3 years in the ground carried no real legal weight against the interests of the shareholders. One board member, a longtime ally of Eleanor's named Douglas Kern, went so far as to suggest that the safest path forward was to bury Jack in litigation until he had no choice but to comply, wearing him down through cost and time until he simply signed whatever the company put in front of him. Eleanor stood against them, laying out in plain terms what would happen if the company chose that path. If they sued a man who had spent nearly 2 decades quietly saving the company from collapse after collapse, word would spread through the industry within days. Every engineer worth hiring would read the story and understand exactly what kind of place they would be walking into. No young researcher with real talent would ever again trust the corporation with their best work, and the company would spend the next decade paying premium salaries just to attract mediocrity, because the people who actually mattered would go elsewhere the moment they had a choice. The argument in that boardroom stretched late into the evening, voices rising over one another, old alliances fracturing along lines that had nothing to do with the org chart and everything to do with what each person valued more, the company's short-term leverage or its long-term survival. Douglas accused her of losing her nerve, of letting a personal apology cloud a business decision that should have been simple. "You are protecting one engineer at the expense of every shareholder in this room," he told her, his voice rising over the table. Eleanor did not raise hers to match him. "I am protecting every engineer who has not left yet," she answered, and the room went still around the two of them. Another board member accused Douglas of caring more about punishment than profit. And the argument split further. Old friendships fraying in real time as each person weighed what mattered more to them, the comfort of the old way of doing things or the uncertain cost of changing it. Eleanor let them argue for nearly an hour before she spoke again. And when she did, her voice was quieter than it had been all evening, which somehow carried further than shouting would have. She told them plainly that she would resign before she put her name on a lawsuit against Jack Carter. It was a bluff none of them expected from a woman who had never once threatened to walk away from anything. Until finally, worn down by her refusal to budge and unwilling to lose their chief executive over a fight, none of them wanted their names attached to publicly. The board relented. Eleanor made a choice she had never made before in her career. She chose to stand beside an employee instead of standing behind the comfortable armor of executive power, knowing that the decision might cost her the support of the very board that had appointed her, and deciding, for the first time, that the cost was worth paying. A year passed, and the company that emerged from that year bore little resemblance to the one Jack had walked out of on a quiet afternoon that now felt like it belonged to someone else's history. Every patent filed from that point forward listed its inventors in full, with no names quietly omitted to preserve some executive's narrative of a lone visionary running the show behind the scenes. The acquisition itself was eventually restructured, renegotiated over several tense weeks with Patricia Whitfield and her team, this time with Jack seated at the table as an equal party rather than an absent name buried in a folder, and the deal closed at a figure not far from its original valuation. Once the intellectual property questions were properly resolved and documented for the first time in the company's history, the stock, which had wavered dangerously in the weeks after the failed signing, slowly recovered as the market absorbed the news that the company had chosen transparency over a cover-up, that it had corrected its course rather than burying the problem the way so many corporations before it had chosen to do. The change did not happen overnight. It took new policies, new review processes, and more than a few uncomfortable conversations with managers who had built their own reputations on absorbing credit that was never entirely theirs. But slowly, the shift took hold, and researchers who had spent years working anonymously in labs began appearing at product launches, invited to explain their own work in their own words, standing in front of cameras that had once only ever pointed at executives. The old culture of the unnamed hero who solved everything and received nothing slowly dissolved, replaced by something closer to what Harold Mitchell had perhaps always intended before his private agreement with Jack, calcified into something larger than either of them anticipated. Jack returned to the company, though not for the money that had been offered to him a dozen times over by then. Money he quietly turned down again even as the offers grew more elaborate, and not for a title that had never meant much to him in the first place. He returned to lead a newly created Institute for Independent Innovation within the corporation, an arrangement built specifically around the lessons of the year before, one that gave him full autonomy over his own research, and gave him the authority to guarantee that every inventor working under him would receive proper and permanent credit for what they built. Protected in writing this time, not left to the informal trust of a handshake that could disappear along with the person who made it. Standing before the entire staff of the company months later, in an auditorium that had once hosted the award ceremonies Jack never attended, Eleanor gave a speech unlike any she had given before, one without a single rehearsed line about vision or momentum. "My biggest mistake was not firing an engineer without asking a single question," she told them. Her voice steady but stripped of the polish she usually brought to public appearances. "My biggest mistake was believing that a title could ever tell you the true value of a person." She looked out across the room, searching briefly for a face near the back that she had learned, over the past year, to actually notice. We build entire systems to measure everything about a person except the thing that actually matters, she continued. How long they show up before anyone asks them to, how much they carry without ever mentioning the weight of it. We reward the people who tell us how good they are, and we forget to ask the ones who never say anything at all. After the applause faded and the staff filed out of the auditorium in small clusters of quiet conversation, Eleanor found Jack near the exit, leaning against the wall the way he always did, waiting for the crowd to thin before he moved through it. She did not thank him for staying. She only asked whether the new researchers assigned to his lab were working out. He told her they were, that one of them reminded him a little of himself at that age. Quiet, stubborn, more comfortable with a problem than with a room full of people. Eleanor smiled at that, the first easy smile either of them had shared since the afternoon she had told him he was fired, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said. The story closes on an image that says more than any speech could. A fresh batch of patents released to the public under the company's name, each one carrying its inventor listed clearly on the very first line. Inventor, Jack Carter. No longer hidden behind a founder's private promise. No longer buried under someone else's name. No longer forgotten in the quiet hours before 5 in the morning when nobody else was watching. The lab where he once worked entirely alone now had 3 younger researchers assigned beside him, each one learning not just the science but the quieter lesson underneath it, that the work itself was allowed to speak, and that someone, finally, was listening. Walter Higgins, the night security guard who had exchanged nothing more than nods and comments about the weather for years, still greeted Jack every morning before 5 o'clock, though now he did it with a small grin, calling him Mr. Carter, in a tone that had shifted from routine to something closer to respect. Jack still arrived before the building lights came on. He still drank his coffee black from the same chipped mug. Some things, it turned out, did not need to change to finally be seen. The company that had nearly lost him, and nearly lost itself in the process, was different now in ways that did not always announce themselves loudly, in a hallway where researchers stopped to explain their work to visitors, instead of hurrying past, in a review process where a warning email could no longer disappear quietly into an inbox, nobody checked. In a boardroom where a name on a patent was treated as a fact worth verifying before any decision was made, not an afterthought to be discovered only when the money was already on the table. None of it undid what had happened. None of it gave